Babicz, and I teach history at the University of Colorado. And by far my most popular class, one that I teach every semester, is a class called American History Through Baseball. And Gabriel asked me if I'd be interested to give a talk about this subject to the COVID, and I said, absolutely. So let me get started with this talk. And I want to start by talking about pre-industrial America, democracy, and baseball. In 1831, the French government sent a bureaucrat named Alexis de Tocqueville to America to study the U.S. prison system. And Tocqueville became fascinated with American society when he was here. He was impressed with the lack of great wealth in the United States and the absence of great poverty. Unlike Europe, where a few people owned lots of wealth and most people lived in abject poverty. When Tocqueville arrived in America, 2/3 of Americans made their living farming, and most white men own their own farms. And only 10% of Americans, when Tocqueville visited, lived in cities or towns of more than 2,500 people. And what Tocqueville was sensing was America's concept of equality. Not only did the Declaration of Independence say all men were created equal, but Tocqueville recognized that Americans really believed this. Inequality was a function of the land. There was so much land available in America that almost anyone could acquire land, then start to acquire wealth and rise up in society. Unlike in Europe, where you were stuck in the social class where you were born. And it's at this time when Tocqueville came that baseball starts to emerge as an organized game. The first children's books that published the rules of baseball were published between 1829 and 1835. So right as Tocqueville is visiting America. And baseball really captured a snapshot of what pre-industrial America was like. America, as I said, had plenty of land. Baseball was a game that required lots of land. Remember, before the outfield walls were erected, the foul lines continued forever. Baseball also represented equality. Every player on the team came to bat, which meant that every player on the team had the opportunity to score. And baseball also represented the American concept of individualism. The batter doesn't get help from a teammate. He has to alone face 9 opponents. And finally, unlike other games, baseball was not governed by a clock. So baseball's representing pre-industrial America, and you could compare it to football, which emerged 50 years later in industrial America. Football's played on a confined space, the gridiron. It doesn't extend forever. Football's not a game that represented equality or democracy, because not every player can touch the ball. Not every player can score. And football is governed by a clock like industrial workers. So baseball represented America at the time of Tocqueville. Oh, I didn't jump to the slide, but this is a slide listing the names of those children's books that were published between 1829 and 1835 that first carried the rules for the game of baseball, which at first was called Rounders, but by 1835, the books called it baseball. Okay, so America doesn't stay in pre-industrial times. America industrialized starting around the War of 1812, but it really kicks in after the Civil War. And men like John D. Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie found a niche to create a business. Rockefeller, I'm sorry, this thing is advancing on me. Let me move my paper. Okay, Rockefeller found a niche in the oil industry. Carnegie found a niche in the steel industry. And they built these huge corporations, Standard Oil and Carnegie Steel, and they looked to maximize their profit. One of the ways they did was how they paid their workers. They paid them very little pay, had them work long hours, often in dangerous conditions. They also looked to eliminate competition, either by forming monopolies or trusts. And so these guys are trying to make as much profit as they could. Their workers often did not seem to get a fair shake. And so when they couldn't get the company to give them a raise or to give them safer working conditions, they began to form unions. The Knights of Labor was organized in 1869. The American Federation of Labor was organized in 1886. And sometimes these workers went on strikes. And some of these strikes, like the Great Railroad Strike of 1877 or the Homestead Steel Strike of 1892 or the Pullman Strike of 1894, turned very violent. And these strikes were often ended when the U.S. government sent in the army to end the strike. So the government at the time was taking the side of the employers over the side of workers. These workers, as I said, work long hours for very little pay. And when they're done working, they need some form of entertainment, some form of amusement. And these workers couldn't afford the type of entertainment that the middle class would view. They couldn't afford to go to plays or concerts or operas. And so they found other things to do. The most popular form of entertainment for workers in the Gilded Age, this period between the end of the Civil War and 1900, was going to a bar or a saloon. Other entrepreneurs started businesses offering entertainment at low prices. And so we get rolling skating rinks established after the Civil War. Bowling alleys are set up after the Civil War. Amusement parks. Coney Island in Brooklyn ends up with 5 amusement parks. And by the late 1890s, we get storefront theaters that show short 1 or 2 minute movie reels of a silent film for a nickel. And so this is entertaining America. And it's at this time that we see baseball industrializing as well. The first baseball clubs were formed in the New York City area in the 1840s and 1850s. And these clubs were sort of like social clubs, like country clubs. But instead of playing golf, the members played baseball. And in 1858, a number of these clubs organized the first league, the National Association of Baseball Players, which awarded a championship at the end of every season. Now, these ball players were supposed to be amateurs, but once a championship was awarded, there's pressure on to win. So these clubs try to attract the best players by finding a few really good ones and secretly paying them to play. Eventually, these clubs spread out beyond the New York area, and in 1867, a group of businessmen in Cincinnati set up a club that they called the Cincinnati Red Stockings. And that year, a team from the East, the National Baseball Club of Washington, D.C., went on a tour of the Midwest. They played the Cincinnati Red Stockings in a game, and they embarrassed them. They beat them by a score of 53-10. And the businessmen decided that they don't want to be embarrassed like this again. So they decided they're going to find a few ringers and secretly pay them as well, which is what many of the clubs in the East were doing. After the 1868 season was over, the National Association of Baseball Players announced that it's okay to pay players. And so the club in Cincinnati decided it was going to go with only professional players. So in 1869, the Cincinnati Red Stockings had the first openly all-professional team. And this team was unbeatable. They went undefeated that year. And their winning streak finally ended in June of 1870 when they lost the game in extra innings. Because the Red Stockings were unbeatable, people turned out to see this team play. But once they lost, the luster sort of wore off. It'd be like if the Harlem Globetrotters lose a game, people might stop going to watch them play. So when the 1870 season was over, the financial backers of the Red Stockings put the team out of business. But other clubs realized that they had discovered the secret. So other clubs adopted Cincinnati's all-professional model. And in 1871, a group of professional clubs set up the first professional league, the National Association. But there were problems with this league. Membership was too cheap. It only cost $10 to join. And this meant that clubs that were not financially strong could join the league and then might drop out in the middle of the season. Other clubs might join in the middle of the season to fill the schedule. And some cities had more than one team. Washington, D.C. had two teams in 1871. Philadelphia had three teams in 1875. Other problems with the National Association is they allowed gambling in the ballparks. There would be bookies who would set up tables at the ballpark and customers would place bets. Sometimes players in uniform would place bets. And this led fans to question whether the game was honest. There was also a lack of discipline. Players would often jump from one team to the next when they were offered more money, even during the middle of the season. And teams that were out of the pennant race sometimes did not go on their final road trips because they didn't want to spend the money on train fare, lodging, and food for the players. But the biggest problem of the National Association was the lack of competition. The Philadelphia Athletics won the first pennant in 1871, but after that, the Boston Red Stockings won every pennant, and they were winning by a bigger and bigger margin every year. The president of one of the teams, William Hulbert, who was the president of the Chicago White Stockings, wanted his team to be a business that provided a source of entertainment for people, but he wanted to make a profit from this business. And he knew he couldn't make a profit in the chaotic atmosphere of the National Association. In 1875, he signed 5 stars on other teams, including Albert Spalding, the best pitcher of the day, and Adrian Cap-Anson, a young rising star. He didn't want them to jump to his team right away because he thought that was one of the problems. He told these guys, keep quiet about it and come to play for my team next season. But the word leaked out. He was afraid he would be kicked out of baseball, so he decided the solution was to set up a new league, a league where his team could make a profit. So in 1876, William Hulbert sets up the National League, which is still around today. The Rockies are a member of this league. To keep out financially weak teams, he charged $100 to join the league. There would only be one team per city. Other rules were meant to keep the games what we would call today family friendly. There would be no games on Sundays, no alcohol sold at games, no gambling at games, and to keep out the riffraff, it would cost 50 cents to go to a National League game when most other baseball teams were only charging a quarter. The National League began in 1876 with 8 teams, and Hulbert is going to use discipline to enforce this strict rules that he set up. In 1876, the New York Mutuals and the Philadelphia Athletics did not go on their final road trip. They were out of the pennant race and they didn't see any point in spending the money. When the season was over, Hulbert kicked the Mutuals and the Athletics out of the National League, even though New York was the largest city in the country, and at the time Philadelphia was the second largest city in the country. The next year, the Louisville Grays were cruising along in first place. And they're cruising along in first place, and they lose 7 games in a row in August. Rumors start to spread that some of the players were taking money from gamblers to lose. Hulbert immediately kicked those players out, and when the season was over, he revoked the Louisville franchise. In 1880, the Cincinnati Reds were playing games on Sundays and selling beer at the games. And so when that season was over, Hulbert kicked Cincinnati out of the league. And so the National League exerted strong discipline, and it was an atmosphere where teams like the White Stockings could make a profit. but at a cost. The National League had kicked out larger cities like New York, Philadelphia, and Cincinnati, and replaced them with teams in smaller cities like Providence, Rhode Island, Syracuse, New York, Worcester, Massachusetts, and Troy, New York. Cincinnati, which was kicked out of the National League, still enjoyed baseball. So in 1881, an independent team from Cincinnati played an independent team from St. Louis, which no longer had a National League team, and the series was successful. So in 1882, the Cincinnati Reds set up a new league. The prosperity of the National League was the inspiration, but this new league was located in larger cities than the National League, with teams in Baltimore, Cincinnati, Louisville, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, and St. Louis. And the American Association is going to offer a rowdier version of baseball. They will allow games on Sundays. They will allow the sale of beer at their games. And they will draw a wider working class audience by only charging 25 cents for admission to a game. And the creation of this league created competition with the National League for players. And this is driving up the salary of players. In 1883, both leagues put teams in New York and Philadelphia. So now there's not only competition for players, there's competition for fans. Now, what would Andrew Carnegie or John D. Rockefeller do if they encountered competition? They would try to eliminate it by forming a monopoly or forming a trust. And that's what these two leagues did. They sat down and negotiated an agreement, the national agreement, which was really a collusion to create a trust. The two leagues, as well as a minor league at the time, the Northwestern League, agreed not to sign players that belonged to the other team, to respect each other's contract. And they also agreed to respect each other's territory, to not put a team in the market where the other league has a team. They agreed New York and Philadelphia could afford two teams, but no more sharing markets after that. And once these two leagues collude and create this trust, they could start a postseason championship. So in 1884, we get the first World Series between the National League pennant-winning Providence Grays and the American Association pennant-winning New York Metropolitans. That year, it was a best-of-5 World Series, and the Grays swept the Mets 3-0. Now, the baseball teams also tried to keep their salaries down by adopting the reserve clause in 1879. Under the reserve clause, no team could sign a player whose contract with another team had expired. Only the team he used to play for could sign that player to a new contract, which meant players had no negotiating leverage with their teams. They had to either accept the contract they were offered or they couldn't play baseball. Players objected to this. And just like workers were doing in other industries, in 1885, baseball players set up their own union. This union was created by a shortstop for the New York Giants named John Montgomery Ward, and it was called the Brotherhood of Professional Baseball Players. And in 1890, the Brotherhood did what workers at Homestead Steel did or the Pullman Company did. They essentially went on strike. And they did this in 1890 by setting up their own league, the Players League. And the players would be co-owners of the teams in this league. And so the Players League was competing with both the National League and the American Association. But the Players League, because the players were co-owners, did not have deep pockets. And when the season was over, the players and their partners, their co-investors in these teams, could not afford to pay all their bills. And so the Players League went back out of business following the 1890 season. And the players all had to return to their original teams. And so the Brotherhood was unsuccessful in getting rid of the reserve clause. And the reserve clause would hang around for another 85 years. But like Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie, William Hulbert and Albert Spalding were also building their empires. They saw a niche, providing inexpensive entertainment for baseball fans. And like Rockefeller and Carnegie, they sought to maximize their profits. They formed a trust with the two leagues to lower salaries and to divide up the markets. And the baseball players, like the workers of the Gilded Age, had grievances. And like other workers, they formed a union and they went on strike. And like most other workers of the Gilded Age, their strike was unsuccessful. All right, well, another way American history was paralleled in baseball had to do with Jim Crow and the color barrier. Segregation did not exist in the South before the Civil War. It was adopted in the 1880s and 1890s. The South adopted segregation to get around the 14th Amendment, which said all people born in the United States are citizens. Well, because of that, people born in the U.S. were citizens. But in the South, with adopting segregation laws in the 1880s and 1890s, African Americans ended up being second-class citizens. They were banned or separated, I should say, in public places from white people so that they rode in separate railroad cars. They stayed in separate hotels. They waited in separate waiting rooms at train stations and bus stations. Their children attended separate schools. And when they died, they were buried in separate cemeteries. And in 1896, the Supreme Court, in the case of Plessy v. Ferguson, said this is constitutional as long as the facilities are separate but equal. Of course, they weren't really equal. A community builds a new school. Who gets to go to the new school? The white kids. The black kids go to the old school where the roof leaks, where the boiler doesn't work. And so, forced out of mainstream society, African Americans responded by creating their own institutions. They created black schools and black universities, black churches, black businesses. Black businessmen set up their own businesses to serve black customers. They even created a black motion picture industry that thrived from the 19 teens to 1950s. Well, baseball was experiencing the same thing. After the Civil War, some doors were closed to black athletes, but there were other places where African Americans could play baseball. And the first African American to be paid to play baseball was probably a guy named Bud Fowler, who played for an independent team in Newcastle, Pennsylvania in 1872. The first African American in the major leagues was probably a man named William Edward White, who played for the Providence Grays in 1879. The thing was, few people realized this guy was black. He was very light-skinned. The first openly African-American player in the major leagues was a catcher for the Toledo Blue Stockings named Moses Fleetwood Walker. Walker was sort of a curiosity. There were not a lot of people objecting to him playing. Most people saw him as something different because they were not used to seeing black baseball players. A few places objected. The two southernmost teams in the major leagues, the Louisville Colonels and the Richmond Virginians, didn't want him playing. So when Toledo went to Kentucky or Virginia to play those teams, it didn't take Walker with them. But one guy who really objected was Cap Anson, the leader of the Chicago White Sox. And when the Chicago White Sox had an exhibition game against Toledo, Cap Anson objected to Walker being on the team. And the manager of Toledo said, look, if he doesn't play, we're playing him. And Anson said, look, if you play him, we're not going to play. And the manager of Toledo said, look, if you don't play, you don't get paid. And Anson backed down. And that was probably the high watermark of African Americans in baseball. Walker wasn't the only guy in professional baseball. His brother Weldy played a few games for Toledo, and there were several black stars in the minor leagues, including Frank Grant of the top-level Buffalo Bisons and George Stovey, who was probably the best black pitcher in baseball at the time. And in 1887, the White Stockings are playing an exhibition game against the Newark team where George Stovey plays. Walker is also on that team that year. And once again, Anson objects. But this time the manager of the Newark team backed down. He said, okay, we won't play these guys. And with that, the color barrier was born, an unwritten agreement among Major League Baseball teams that they would not use African American players in ball games. The color barrier was in effect in the major leagues from the mid-1880s until 1947, and it went into effect in the minor leagues in the early 1890s, the same decades that the Jim Crow laws were being adopted. Well, African Americans responded to Jim Crow by creating their own institutions. They did the same in baseball. The first all-professional black team was probably a team at a resort on Long Island called the Argyle Hotel. This team was called the Cuban Giants, and tourists from New York City who stayed at the hotel could take in a ball game in between trips to the beach. Other black teams were forming at this time. They weren't in any organized league, so they would play who would ever play them. They played against other local teams. They played against other black teams. Sometimes they played exhibition games against white major or minor league teams. And in 1920, Rube Foster, a former African-American baseball player, formed the first Negro League, the Negro National League, which had 8 teams, and it operated in the Midwest from 1920 to 1931. A second African-American team, the Eastern Colored League, was set up on the East Coast in 1923. This league operated until 1928. The Great Depression put these two leagues out of business, but new Negro leagues are set up in the mid-1930s. The Negro National League was revived in 1933, and a new Negro American League was set up in 1937. And with these two leagues, a Negro League World Series could be held. But that wasn't really the high point of the black calendar, because it took 7 games, and few black workers could afford to take 7 days off from work. So the most popular event on the Negro League calendar was the East-West All-Star Game, an All-Star Game played every year at Chicago's Comiskey Park starting in 1933 and played until the early 60s. This game regularly drew 35,000 people. Often it outdrew the Major League All-Star Game. All right, so we see race relations in the 19th and early 20th century in baseball imitating what's happening in America. Progressivism is another thing that's being imitated in baseball. Because of industrialization, there were a number of problems in America after the Civil War. Workers worked long hours for low pay, often in dangerous conditions. Consumers were often sold dangerous products, especially in the meatpacking industry, which was illustrated in Upton Sinclair's 1906 novel, The Jungle. Monopolies and trust eliminated competition, which kept prices high and produced poor quality products for consumers. And in the late 19th century, a middle-class reform movement called progressivism emerged. Progressives believed in science. They believed that science, technology, listening to experts will make the future better than the past, will create stability, and will create order out of chaos. And progressivism was supported by middle-class urbanites living in the cities of the Northeast, the Great Lakes, and the West Coast. And in 1901, Theodore Roosevelt becomes the first progressive president. Roosevelt was a trust buster. He broke up trusts and monopolies. He supported workers. In 1902, he supported the coal miners who were on strike, changing the government's position from supporting employers to supporting workers. And he supported consumers. He got Congress to pass the Pure Food and Drug Act in 1906 and to pass the Meat Inspection Act in 1906. Well, during the late 19th century, baseball also had problems. In 1892, the National League and the American Association merged. 4 teams from the American Association joined the National League. The other 4 teams went out of business. But these 12 teams competed in a single division, which meant there was no natural format to continue the World Series. Instead, baseball tried something new. They had a Temple Cup series in which the first place team played the second place team in a best-of-7 series for this trophy called the Temple Cup. Well, the Temple Cup was never very popular because the pennant winner has nothing to gain by winning that series and everything to lose. After 1897, the Temple Cup is abandoned. Other problems experienced by baseball in the 1890s, including cheating. And the Baltimore Orioles were notorious at this. This was a really good team. They had 6 future Hall of Famers on their roster, plus their manager was a future Hall of Famer. But they still cheated. There was only one umpire in the 1890s, and so when the umpire was watching a fly ball hit to the outfield, a runner on first on the Orioles would often run straight to third without going to second base. A third baseman, John McGraw, would often stick his finger in the belt of a runner on third to slow that runner down if he was tagging up on a fly ball. And the ground crew helped the team by making the dirt in front of a home plate as hard as concrete so that the Baltimore players could swing down at the pitch and it would bounce high in the air, which is what we call a Baltimore chop now. By the time the ball came back down, the batter was already at first. They also tilted the foul line so Oriole bunts would roll fair. And they kept the outfield grass tall so Oriole outfielders could hide extra balls in the grass so that if the ball was hit over their head, they could retrieve a different ball and throw it in. So cheating was a problem. The biggest problem, however, was syndicated baseball, in which the same ownership group owned more than one major league team. One group owned the team in Brooklyn and the team in Baltimore. Another group owned the team in Pittsburgh and the team in Louisville. A third group owned the team in St. Louis and the team in Cleveland. And these groups discovered that the more popular team attracted more fans, so they would start to trade their best players to the more popular team. The Baltimore Orioles traded Wee Willie Keeler to Brooklyn. The Louisville Colonels traded Hannes Wagner to Pittsburgh. And the Cleveland Spiders traded Cy Young to St. Louis. In fact, Cleveland traded away so many players that the team in 1899 became the worst team in baseball history. That year, the Spiders only won 20 games and lost 134. Well, the National League realizes it's got a problem, and in 1900, it goes back to only having 8 teams, dropping the teams in Baltimore, Cleveland, Louisville, and Washington, D.C. But this put a lot of players out of work, and it also denied fans in several cities a chance to go to major league games. And the head of a minor league, Ban Johnson, who was the president of the Western League, saw an opportunity. Johnson was baseball's Teddy Roosevelt. He will break up the National League monopoly. He was also a strict leader, backing up umpires. And so in 1900, he renames the Western League the American League. And the next year, he declares the American League a major league. And so now the American League is competing with the National League. They're competing for players, which is pushing up salaries. They're competing for fans in a number of cities, which is lowering attendance. And the two leagues decide to revive the national agreement, where they will respect each other's player contracts and where they would not interfere in other teams' markets. And with the new national agreement, with this new collusion, they could resume a postseason series. So in 1903, we get the first modern World Series, where the Boston Pilgrims, today the Red Sox, defeated the Pittsburgh Pirates in a best of 8 game series, a best of 9 game series, 5-3. And just like the progressives sought to create order out of chaos, that's what Ban Johnson did. And for the next 50 years, Major League Baseball will not change. It'll be the same 16 teams in the same 10 cities from 1903 to 1952. Well, baseball not only reflected the progressive era, but it's going to reflect the chaos and the excitement of the post-World War I period. Following World War I, there were a number of scandals breaking out in America. Prohibition, the 18th Amendment, banned the sale or manufacture of alcohol. And so bootleggers like Al Capone blatantly made alcohol available to Americans who wanted it. Movie star Fatty Arbuckle was accused of murder in the death of actress Virginia Rapp, and his trial captured the country's imagination. In fact, he was tried 3 times before he was acquitted. And scandals even reached the White House, as the Secretary of the Interior lent out government land to 2 friends of his in the oil industry, Harry Sinclair and Edward Doheny, and he leased this land to them at below market values. This was known as the Teapot Dome scandal. The 1920s was also an age when people were obsessed with celebrities. Movie stars captured the public's imagination, not just Fatty Arbuckle, but the public was obsessed when actor Rudolph Valentino collapsed and died. Other celebrities captured the public's interest. Charles Lindbergh flew from New York to Paris alone, and when he came back, he was America's greatest hero. Well, baseball is experiencing the same things. The scandals that took place after World War I included the 1919 Black Sox scandal, in which 8 members of the Chicago White Sox took money from gamblers to lose the World Series. And despite the popularity of movie stars or even of Charles Lindbergh, no celebrity received more attention than baseball player Babe Ruth. Baseball will continue to mimic America at the mid-century point. During World War II, when soldiers were fighting in the war, America still needed 60 million workers in the defense plants. Okay, so they got 16 million soldiers fighting. There's not enough men to do the job. And so 6 million women take jobs in the defense plants. These women were colloquially called Rosie the Riveter. Well, the same thing is going to happen in baseball. The owner of the Cubs, William Wrigley, was afraid that the war might shut down baseball, and he could not afford to have Wrigley Field go without a tenant. So he set up a women's league called the All-American Girls Professional League. This league will play in small Midwestern cities, but it's there so that if the Cubs can no longer play, Wrigley can move these games to Wrigley Field. So not only did World War II give us Rosie the Riveter, it also gave us Rosie the Right Fielder. After the war was over, America will experience tremendous prosperity. There's pent-up consumer demand because for 15 years, Americans weren't buying consumer products. Nobody could afford to buy them in the 1930s. And in the early 40s, we were busy at war, and so the factories weren't making them. And so now consumers want new cars and new refrigerators. They want televisions. And you know what? There's no foreign competition because Britain, Europe, Japan, their factories were destroyed, their infrastructures were destroyed. But America came out of the war unscathed. And so American companies are making a huge profit. The country's also changing. The US population doubled between 1900 and 1950. There were 76 million people in the US in 1900. In 1950, there were 151 million people. And people are moving. People are leaving the Northeast and the Midwest, moving to the Sun Belt. In 1940, California was the fifth largest state in the Union with 7 million people. 10 years later, California is the second most populous state with 10.5 million people. Other people are leaving the cities and moving to the suburbs. The first suburb was constructed on Long Island in 1947. It was known as Levittown, and soon suburbs are springing up around cities all over the country. And there's one other thing affecting America after the war. We get a rise in the fear of communism. A senator from Wisconsin, Senator Joseph McCarthy, will accuse people of subversion, of treason, and of disloyalty without any evidence to advance his political career. Well, these changes taking place in mid-century were reflected in baseball. Baseball was tremendously popular during this time, and baseball teams had not changed in 50 years. The last franchise shift had been in 1903. But finally, with the American population changing, the Major League map starts to change. In the early 50s, the Boston Braves became the Milwaukee Braves in 1953. The St. Louis Browns became the Baltimore Orioles in 1954. And the Philadelphia Athletics became the Kansas City Athletics in 1955. But those changes kept baseball in the northeastern quadrant of the United States. In 1958, baseball became a national game when two teams left New York City and moved to California. The New York Giants became the San Francisco Giants, and the Brooklyn Dodgers became the Los Angeles Dodgers. And by the early 60s, baseball teams are moving to the suburbs. Starting in 1961, the new Minnesota Twins are not playing in the Twin Cities. They're playing in suburban Bloomington on the location of today's Mall of America. In 1964, the New York Mets leave the Polo Grounds in Harlem and move to a new stadium in Flushing Meadows, a stadium where there's plenty of room for cars. In 1962, the new team in Houston set up their stadium in a residential suburban area of the city called the Medical Center District. And in 1966, the Angels left downtown Los Angeles for suburban Anaheim in Orange County near Disneyland. There's another thing that's affecting baseball. The second Red Scare, this fear of communism. In 1949, African-American actor Paul Robeson announced at a Moscow-sponsored peace conference in Paris that Black Americans would not fight for America in a war against the Soviet Union. Well, this was quite startling, and congressmen want to know if it's true. So they called the most famous African-American in the country, Jackie Robinson, to testify before the House Committee on Un-American Activities to find out if this is true, as if Robinson could testify for every African-American in the country. Robinson said it's not true. He said he can't speak for everyone, but he would fight for the United States. Also, because of the second Red Scare in 1954, the Cincinnati Reds changed their name. They didn't want to sound like supporters of communism, so they became the Cincinnati Redlegs, quietly going back to their original name in 1961. Civil rights is actually something that baseball did not imitate America as much as baseball inspired America. During World War II, when America was fighting Nazi oppression, many Americans recognized a problem. The U.S. was denying freedom to 13 million U.S. citizens, and Americans recognized hypocrisy. And so after the war, there are people demanding changes, and changes start happening. In 1948, President Truman integrated the military. In 1954, the Brown v. Board of Ed decision integrated public schools. In 1955, Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a Montgomery, Alabama city bus, which led to a boycott of the Montgomery bus system by African Americans. And the boycott launched a local minister, Martin Luther King, into the national spotlight. In 1964, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which banned discrimination in public accommodations. And the following year, the Voting Rights Act was passed, which banned literacy tests. Well, segregation ended in baseball before any of this. In 1923, the Sporting News printed an editorial calling for an end of the color barrier. In 1942, minor league owner Bill Veeck tried to buy the Philadelphia Phillies. He's got a plan. It's hard to find players during the war. He's going to stock the Phillies with an all-star team of Negro League players. On his way to Philadelphia, he stops off in Chicago to tell the commissioner, Kennesaw Mountain Landis, of his plan. And when Veeck arrives in Philadelphia, he discovers the Phillies are no longer for sale. During the war, Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia of New York City, a city with 3 Major League Baseball teams, started to pressure the Yankees, the Giants, and the Dodgers to integrate. Boston's doing the same thing with its 2 teams, the Braves and the Red Sox. And to satisfy city officials, the Red Sox are going to hold a tryout. Meanwhile, in New York, the state legislature adopts the Ives-Quinn bill, which bans discrimination in hiring for all businesses, including baseball. And in Boston, the Red Sox hold a tryout, inviting Jackie Robinson, Sam Jethro, and Marvin Williams of the Negro Leagues to try out for Boston. This was done just for show, to show the city officials. Nothing came of this tryout. But in 1943, Branch Rickey became the president and general manager of the Brooklyn Dodgers. Rickey was a strict Methodist who had a moral objection to the color barrier, but he also liked to make money. And he saw how African-American fans could increase his attendance. So he signed Jackie Robinson to a contract in the summer of 1945. And he got Robinson to promise not to fight back. And on civil rights, baseball led American society. Before Truman integrated the military, before Brown v. Board of Ed, the Brooklyn Dodgers were integrated. And this will change the way Americans looked at race. The first time Jackie Robinson took the field, a Brooklyn Dodger fan, especially a white Brooklyn Dodger fan, could not help notice that this man was black. But as the season went on, and if the Dodgers game was tied and there was a runner in scoring position and it was late in the game and Jackie Robinson stepped into the batter's box, those Dodger fans no longer looked at Robinson as a black man. They looked at him as the man who could win the game. And so this totally changed the way Americans were looking at race. And as more teams signed African-American players, people in other cities started to view race the same way. Baseball also imitated the protests of the 1960s and 1970s. The civil rights movement was still going strong in the 1960s. In the 60s, young people were involved in the youth movement and the counterculture movement. And as the Vietnam War was, as the Vietnam War dragged on, anti-war protesters protested the war. And the women's movement grew in the 60s, starting with the publication of Betty Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique. And in the 70s, the women's movement is trying to get the Equal Rights Amendment added to the U.S. Constitution. Some of these protests dripped into baseball. Charlie Finley, the owner of the Athletics, will be influenced by the counterculture. In 1963, he dresses the A's in non-traditional colors, Kelly green and bright gold. In 1964, he paid the Beatles $150,000 to play a concert at Kansas City's Municipal Stadium. And after he moved the A's to Oakland, he will continue with the counterculture. He will pay the players on the A's a bonus if they grow facial hair. He will introduce the designated hitter rule in baseball. He also tried to introduce a designated runner, which didn't work out well. He wanted to show it would work, so he signed a world-class sprinter named Herb Washington. And in the 1974 World Series, Herb Washington gets picked off at first base. So that idea didn't work. He also wanted to introduce an orange baseball because he thought it would be easier for the batters to see it. The problem was the red stitching and the orange leather made it hard for batters to see the spin. And so that didn't work at all. But certainly he's influenced by the counterculture. The women's movement also influenced baseball. In 1962, Joan Payson became the first female owner of a major league team when she was the owner of the New York Mets. In the 1970s, Pam Postema became a minor league umpire. She umpired in the minor leagues for about a dozen years, but unfortunately she was never promoted to the major leagues. And in the mid-70s, tennis player Billie Jean King and professional softball player Joan Joyce formed a women's professional softball association. This league would last for about 4 years, but by the early 80s, like the Equal Rights Amendment, the International Women's Professional Softball Association was dead. Well, in addition to being influenced by the counterculture and the women's movement, baseball had its own movement in the 60s and 70s, the players' rights movement. In 1966, Marvin Miller became the executive director of the Major League Baseball Players Association, and he turned the MLBPA into a bona fide labor union. He educated the players on the fundamentals of organizing. He got Major League Baseball to agree to creating arbitration for players who had grievances. And Miller's going to work to try to end that reserve clause that had been in effect since 1879. I guess I don't have a slide for that. I thought I did. When a player on the Cardinals, Curt Flood, was traded to the Phillies and didn't want to go, he asked Marvin Miller if there was anything he could do. And Miller said, you could sue the commissioner. And Flood asked, will I win? Miller said, no, you will lose. And you will be driven out of baseball. And Flood said, well, would it help other players? And Miller said, it definitely will. So Flood agreed to sue baseball. And Miller said, you're an organizer's dream. And Miller was right. He lost the lawsuit, and he only played 11 more major league games. In 1974, Charlie Finley neglected to make a payment to pitcher Catfish Hunter into an annuity fund that was required by the contract. So Hunter took it to arbitration. The arbitrator ruled Hunter was a free agent, and Hunter signed with the Yankees for $3.35 million. And that showed players that if they could be free agents, they could make lots of money. And so in 1976 rather, pitcher Andy Messersmith and Dave McNally did not sign a contract for the 75 season. And when the season was over, they declared themselves free agents. Major League Baseball said, no, the reserve clause goes on forever. And so they took it to arbitration. Oh, I'm sorry. There's the slide I was looking for. Curt Flood and Catfish Hunter. Well, anyway, Uh, Messerschmitt and McNally took it to arbitration. And in December, the arbitrator, Peter Seitz, ruled that the reserve clause is only good for 1 year. And if you play 1 year without a contract, it's called playing out your option, you can now be a free agent and you can sign with any team you want. The owners didn't like what the arbitrator said, so they took it to court. And in February of 1976, the court upheld the Seitz decision. So baseball players now had the opportunity to become free agents. And this leads to where we are today, where we are in America and where we are in baseball. The booming economy that boomed for about 20 years, almost 30 years after World War II, started to decline in the 70s. It was booming because of a lack of foreign competition. But by the mid-60s, Britain, Europe, and Japan were back on their feet, and they're making products that are competing with American products. And so foreign competition started to increase in the late 60s, in the 70s, and in the 80s. And with this, the profits of American companies started to decline. In 1965, the average American company made a profit of 10%. By the late 70s, that profit is only about 6%. And American incomes for people starts to decline as well. It's hard to notice because the American standard of living did not change between 1970 and 1980. But there's proof, because in 1970, most families had one breadwinner, the dad. In 1980, most families had two breadwinners, the dad and the mom. And so two incomes were supporting a lifestyle that a decade earlier, one income would support. And so some political economists have referred to this change as the Great U-turn. And we're still struggling with how to deal with this today. We're struggling with foreign competition. We're still looking for how to return to the prosperity of the 1950s. Well, the American economy changed in the mid-70s. That's the economists say the Great U-turn took effect around 1974. The mid-70s, the baseball economy changed as well. With free agency, baseball players' salaries skyrocket, and baseball still has free agency today. And baseball teams are still trying to figure out how to deal with this changing baseball economy, how to run it so that teams could make the profits that they want to make. And so just like America is still dealing with this struggle today, so is baseball. And if you're interested in this stuff and you want to know more about it, I urge you to consult a book that I wrote with CU professor Tom Zeiler. The book is called National Pastime, U.S. History Through Baseball. It goes through U.S. history and looks at the connection between baseball and history, starting with Tocqueville and continuing today and beyond, including looking at baseball becoming a world game.